Thank you. I'm going to address, in a very general way, some of the, shall we say, the relationships between agriculture and the promotion of nutrition and health. And I'm going to give a very general sort of picture of some of the linkages or linkages that might not really be there, and then sort of pass on to the implications for policy and also say a few words of what some of the implications might be for developing countries as they also start to increase their income levels, and as there's a general transformation of integrating developing economies into the global economy and the whole process of globalization, what that might mean for nutrition and health. Basically, what's very important to set any kind of attainable objectives or to frame policies, it seems crucial to understand how the linkages between agriculture and nutrition and health operate. And by that I mean, what is it that we know? What are the mechanisms, in particular being an economist, we'd want to say, well, how would you sort of model those linkages? I mean, are they direct or are they indirect linkages that you'd want to look at? And I think we all recognize, and I've even heard this during the conference these days, is that adequate or even abundant food supplies are not necessarily synonymous with nutrition or an adequate nutrition and good health. And in fact, in times, abundant supplies or abundant consumption actually reverses that health situation. And while we know quite well, and always within a certain amount of error, obviously, the incentive structures to production, they're fairly well known. We can model them. We can do a very good job on production. The linkage between even consumers and their food consumption behavior is much less well known. And I'm going to elaborate on both sides of that equation, because that's where the market meets of supply and demand. So what have we done in agriculture production and the traditional agriculture policies in most OECD countries? That would be the North Americas, and that would be obviously Europe. And those are the, shall we say, the core countries which have had a long history of agricultural support. And that support has focused on, in general, securing adequate incomes for farmers, as well as adequate supplies of food at reasonable prices to consumers. So there's been, over the years, obviously with the Industrial Revolution, with technological change, what we've seen is the increase in agricultural productivity. And that agricultural productivity has been one of the main factors in driving down food prices. And food prices now, if we look to most OECD countries, are somewhere between 10 and 15% of household income, which is very slow. I mean, they have been halved since over the past 25 years. They've actually been brought down to about half. And even in a number of developing countries, they are coming down substantially. Now, this is done through indirect and support prices. And most of the support products have been the traditional, what we call rice pudding, So you've got rice, dairy, sugar, but we also had some wonderful products like tobacco that we support, wine production in Europe. And this whole, shall we say, set of products are not necessarily the ones that you would associate with good nutrition. So we pay producers to produce higher butter fat in their milk. We produce substantial amounts of sugar, etc. And, of course, so we know why producers that get more support, their prices are stable, they're going to produce more. Prices come down because we have an excess supply. And we export part of that supply to the rest of the world. I will not go into right away. Someone can ask me about what that might do to the other countries' production systems. But on the consumer side, well, we ordinarily know, well, consumers, demand food. They go to the supermarkets, they go to the local markets, whatever it is. But they don't usually eat food that's produced by farmers, because farmers don't really produce food I consume. It goes through a whole system. It goes through the food marketing and processing system. So what I buy and what my diet consists of is not necessarily what the agriculture producers produce, okay? So there's already somewhat of a disconnect between my consumption and what they're producing. But obviously, that goes through the food chain, so the lower prices of the inputs affect some of the choices that the processors are likely to make. And given that, over time, the shall we say, the food dollar has the part of agriculture production is about 20% now in developed economies, or even less. If you took bread, it's 2% and other. And most of it is services and labor. So the food industry can make food prices very, very cheap because the fixed cost is labor and energy, and those don't change. Okay. So what about the demand side? Well, on the demand side, prices and income. Okay. So as prices are falling, you demand more. That makes sense, up to a certain point, because the prices are also, we call inelastic demand, so therefore they don't change that much because there's something physical satiety. But then again, income. Okay, so how much then? Well, we have Engel's curve. After a certain amount of 3,000 calories, you just cannot eat anymore because it just won't go. You can change the allocation of your diet, obviously, and you eat things which are more energy dense, etc. And that's what the food industry has been providing us with recently. But in this income side, and I think that's where the link could be with the developing countries, if we're talking about income-constrained people in terms of getting sufficient nutrition and resolving the hunger problem, then we're talking about a poverty problem if they don't have enough money. And if you're talking about that, then obviously the problem is very complicated to solve, okay? Because it's no longer just an agriculture production problem. It's an income problem for which there's very detailed, very precise factors that are involved. And we still need to know a lot more about the poverty, hunger, malnutrition situations and reasons to define better policies and approaches and target specific communities and instances of this hunger and malnutrition. Income growth should have a positive effect on nutrition, provided that the substitution does not occur between what would be called healthy foods or whole grains, fruits and vegetables, and added sugars and added fats. Okay, so just income, it is not certain, it hasn't happened in developing countries. They've had a lot of substitution, and a lot of this has now been accelerated over the past 20 years because we have global markets also. And I don't mean that globalization is not a good thing, but there is an instance where all markets become very similar because the major food companies operate across the globe, and this excess supply, which is being produced sometimes because of these policies, floats totally around the world. Industry is repeating this total process of incorporating what people call value, but it may be just buying cheaper products that can be then made flavorable and tasty to attract consumption. And in developing countries, there's been a rise in incomes also. They should be eating better. But again, the same problem presents itself on whether or not people substitute away from good foods. In addition, what's happened in developing countries is that the fact that they have rising income and rising population, they become magnets for investment of foreign food firms. And foreign food firms know what sells well, what appeals to consumers, to children. I mean, you can go to Uganda, you can go to Laos, you can go to the rural parts of India, and you can see children buying Coca-Cola, chips, and Kit Kats rather than buying the apples of the apple vendor next door. It's not particularly unknown. And so what's happened now is that in the OECD countries, we've been experiencing, because of this abundant food, cheap food, the wrong food perhaps, and because it's good, it's tasty food, there's no doubt, we've been experiencing what we call the one of the unintended consequences, which is the obesity, overweight obesity, and the nutrition-related chronic diseases. And these have been rising, accelerating, and with them have been accelerating the cost to budgets, both in terms of healthcare directly, in terms of days lost of labor, in terms of labor productivity. We heard before about the issue of good nutrition and farmer productivity or labor productivity. We've heard it repeatedly in the conference. This is on the other side. So you may not have enough food, you get those consequences. You have too much food, you get diseases, which also bring you the same consequences of lowering your productivity, absenteeism, and early death. And the data indicate there's a rise in both adult and child obesity rates in countries with over $2,500 GDP in general. The obesity epidemic has touched most countries in Latin America, Central America, North Africa, the Middle East, South Africa. China is starting with overweight, but child obesity, and it's growing, and South Asia, in addition to Europe, Australia, Pacific, and the only places that seem to be saved so far are sub-Saharan Africa, except South Africa. So, and one of the difficulties of this obesity epidemic is not that people are aesthetically unpleasing to look at, but actually because of the nutrition-related diseases, which is diabetes 2, cardiovascular diseases, and some cancers. And these are costly, and they're costly to the person who's affected, and in particularly in systems where there is no national health care. In the systems of national health care, they're a burden, which countries cannot necessarily afford to take into account, as well as for the individual. So, what does this sort of come back to? It says, well, agriculture policies in the OECD countries have never had nutrition into it. And recently we had what was called the health check on this Common Agricultural Policy. And I said, oh, finally they're taking health into account. Had nothing to do with health. It only had to do whether or not their supply and demand balances were okay, and their financing. Had nothing to do with health. So, which can tell you still that in European countries it's very difficult to bring these two issues together, that agriculture policy may have some effects on how the food system itself has operated, which then in turn could have impacts. So what does this mean? What do we do about it, and what could be done about it? This morning we heard about fiscal measures, probably educational programs to encourage people to eat well, also to try and, for developing countries in particular, to think about coherency between agriculture policy and nutritional policies. And that means, again, as that we're talking multi-stakeholder, thinking it through in the beginning stages as you're in the process of development, because once you've reached the stage of the $2,500 income and you have a substantial portion of your population who's obese or overweight, it is almost irreversible. The United States has spent millions in trying to reverse it. The most they can do is hope that it doesn't increase any further. But it's not really reversible. In the individual, because it's very hard, there's a whole literature on the physiology of weight reduction and the costs of it. In the United States, the federal government allows you to take for income tax, even going to a fat farm to reduce weight, operations to tighten your stomach. And, well, hopefully this will not happen in many developing countries, but there are many developing countries that have this problem. South Africa has it, Brazil, Chile. Chile's made a big effort. They've reduced it down for children now. Mexico. And therefore, it's crucial that we think about things before they happen, so that even before you get to the 2,500, or at least in the initial stages where the urban population is already, in most developing countries, overweight. Something like 30% of the women in New Delhi are actually obese. And in many developing countries, the urban rates of overweight are upwards of 40%. So the bell has rung, and so it's important that something be done before it gets out of hand. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda.